Well, I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and for most of my childhood and certainly my teenage years, the reality that I knew was that one got around by driving in a car. And that was pretty much the only way one got around, by driving in a car, because the only places you could go to were only accessible by car, and no sidewalks, so we wouldn't even think about driving a bicycle. As I got older, once I was in college and I spent a little bit of time abroad, I got to experience different ways of getting around. I was very fortunate to live in some places where you could ride a bicycle, where there was some public transit. I lived in a larger, medium-sized city in New Jersey where there was actually a city center. There were places to walk to, and I discovered urban culture. I discovered what happens when you have a certain amount of density and you give people a way to exist in that community without needing to just be sitting in a car all the time and go from parking lot to parking lot. And that really affected me, I think, especially at a young age, where mobility and getting out and having some freedom and autonomy was so important. And at the same time, I was learning a lot about sustainability. This is right back when global warming was suddenly getting into some of the mainstream news in the late 80s, early 90s. And I started making the connections to sustainability. And throughout my studies in college, I started to realize that our cities and the ways in which our cities are designed, the ways in which we use our cities, have huge implications to our global sustainability, to our local resilience. I wouldn't have called it that at the time necessarily. Our cities are basically engines. They take in food and water and materials, and waste goes out, and economic and social and cultural activity are the result. You can have a finely tuned engine, or you can have a very inefficient engine. And I saw that most American cities, and certainly all American suburbs, were very, very inefficient. And they were very vulnerable in many ways. That things like food and water were coming from who knows where, controlled by who knows who, oftentimes large corporations. And it just struck me as a very not a smart way for hundreds of millions of us to be living in the United States, especially when there were so many examples of smarter ways of living in communities all around the world. So pretty early on, I focused my efforts on understanding how cities worked. What are the best ways in which cities can function, and most importantly, what can we do to change our cities in this country to work better? So I just focused more and more on urban sustainability. Over the years, I worked in the public sector, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, and some years ago I was doing some work looking at the efforts of some local governments and some local citizen groups to respond to peak oil. And in the process of doing that, I came across PostCarbon Institute, and they happened to be looking for that kind of work that I was doing, and I happened to be looking for a job. So it came together. And then since then, my work within PostCarbon at first was to be focused on cities, and hence the book that I wrote, PostCarbon Cities, Planning for Energy and Climate Uncertainty, trying to get some thinking together around what is it that makes cities especially vulnerable to peak oil. And not even just cities, but suburbs, really any community. There are ways in which we depend on external flows for food and water and materials. There are assumptions we have in our communities about the availability and the affordability of energy. All assumptions that get thrown out the window once we get past the point of peak oil, because energy prices start to become volatile, supplies start to become volatile. And then of course the concerns about climate change and overall ecosystem degradation as well. So these days with PostCarbon Institute and my work in particular, we're really looking at all of the systems, economic systems, social systems, and of course environmental systems, how they all interrelate, and how these big drivers, the two driving crises, the decline of fossil fuel resources and the increasing, rather the worsening of climate change, how those two drivers are changing the environmental, economic, and social systems that we rely on. How does it change those relationships? How does it change the the ways in which we work with those systems as communities, and most interestingly to me, how does it change? How do our assumptions about how all these things work need to change as a result? Because it's one of the things that we see with climate change and with the decline of fossil fuels is that all the assumptions that we've had about how the industrial world works, how our societies work, those assumptions start to break down. We live in a society that was, for the last 60 years, we built on the assumption of cheap and available oil. Well, that's changed. We've also, over the last few centuries, have located our cities and developed our communities with an assumption of a relatively stable climate. And at a local or regional level, and there are assumptions there about where is the fresh water going to come from, what are the temperature extremes, how far does the sea come in during a storm surge. All those things are starting to change now. And very, very few people are recognizing those changes, let alone responding to them. So I think that's some of the most important work of PostCarbon Institute, pointing out how things are changing, whether it's about climate change and fossil fuels, or whether it's about population trends or threats to public health, trends about water, the changing issues around social justice especially, many of the changing solutions that are developing, particularly around community-supported food systems, some of the work at transition towns. PostCarbon is trying to bring all those things together so that it's understandable and recognizable to both decision makers and households.